Cool. Might start with Hi everyone. Thanks so much for coming. And I know the transport was really annoying, so thanks for coming to Sydenham and seeing the show. So yeah, I think I'll start by sort of introducing sort of speakers today. This is Lucy Sames, Victoria Sin, and Nathalie Boobis on the end. So I'll just sort of introduce the your bios really, and then we can just expand if you want. So Lucy is a curator and researcher based in London. She is a curatorial practice-based PhD candidate at Northumbria University in Newcastle, currently researching the intersection of cybernetics, altered states and mystical diagrams. Lucy is co-curator at Res in Deptford, which is a mutable project based in a gallery and workspace in Deptford, South London. Victoria Sin is an artist using speculative fiction within performance, moving image, writing and print to interpret normative processes of desire, identification and objectification. So this includes drag as a practice of purposeful embodiment, questioning the reification and ascription of ideal images within technologies of representation and systems of looking. And you can, I guess, expand, it's quite a long bio, so we'll, when I sort of throw some questions out, we can kind of expand on these. So Nathalie is a London-based curator. Alongside her independent practice, she works as an Artist Commissions Coordinator for Space London and Junior Fellow for Goldsmiths, CCA London. Her current curatorial research is focused on the potentials of art to give form to alternative futures drawn from suppressed pasts. So independent projects include Our House of Common Weeds, and The Future is a Collective Project. Yeah, I think I'll probably leave it there. So drawing upon sort of archaeology, deep time science fiction and fantasies, we were kind of going to use the central themes of the exhibition to, as a sort of starting point to raise questions around feminist methodologies, collaboration and speculative pasts and futures. So to give sort of some context on the show, so I'm going to start with a quote that I kind of keep returning to, I guess, for a few years, and it sums up my sort of curiosity with the past. So it's in the Deleuze Studies journal. And it's from an essay by Arno Böhler, and it's The Time of Drama in Nietzsche and Deleuze, from a chapter called Remembering the Empty Form of Time. And it sort of references Giorgio Agamben, and I'll just quote it. So in reference to Deleuze's text, Difference and Repetition, Giorgio Agamben rightly reminds us that a lively interaction with the transferred heritage of a certain history is therefore not just about remembering the past in order to prevent it from being forgotten. Rather, the potentiality of an act of remembrance lies in an act of regenerative remembering, which, during the process of recollection, is posthumously returning a future to a past, and thereby gives unfulfilled possibility back to a past. Such a creative, artistic remembering restores possibility to a past, making what happened incomplete and completing what never was. Remembrance is neither what happened nor what did not happen, but rather their potentialization, their becoming possible once again. So they talk about it in this sort of as a plastic interaction with history, in which our transmissions are treated primarily as the material of synthetic performative processes. So this is kind of not about what's stating and staging that which was in performing its historical replay, but about performative interaction with that which has been transmitted to us as rather a fragment, a riddle, a dreadful accident, in order to deal with it in multiple fragmentary ways. So I've always been kind of drawn to return to that kind of quote, and I find that sort of plastic interaction and that performative interaction quite appealing as an artist in my practice. And actually that kind of has some crossovers with Ursula Le Guin's sort of thinking about the carrier bag theory, which Victoria's sort of written about, and I think it would be nice for you to talk about that a bit further. so sort of for this project, it started, I guess, the research within the Future as a Collective project, which Nathalie started kind of 2 years ago, I think now, isn't it? It kind of, and Nathalie will expand upon that, what that was as well, but within that I was researching kind of feminine mythological pasts in prehistoric kind of gynocentric cultures in Europe. And these were investigated by Maria Gimbutas kind of quite famously through the 50s, 60s and 70s. So her fieldwork and speculation on pre-patriarchal societies in old Europe were largely kind of discredited within mainstream archaeology and sort of adopted by like eco-feminists and neo-pagans and sort of the New Age movement as well. And I think what I find kind of exciting about these sort of mythologies and belief systems is that, and they manifest sort of still in sort of contemporary women's oral cultures and material cultures, but they were sort of exclusively like zoomorphic, so they imagine kind of humans always in a sort of transforming state, so becoming trans-species, trans-divine, part human, part animal, part god, and sort of Gimbutas sort of claims that these communities didn't sort of manufacture weapons or defences, so leading her to kind of speculate that this was kind of an egalitarian community, which was sort of between nomadic and settled, and which didn't claim sort of territory by kind of mapping out like boundary markers or anything. So for me, I think this was like quite an exciting opportunity to sort of decreate these ideas of like patriarchal kind of colonial Europe, and think about how it was and how it could be very different. So yeah, and this kind of I found some parallels within this and how like Ursula Le Guin talks about kind of science fiction and thinking about kind of looking at these clues in prehistory and letting them sort of create these sort of seeds of inspiration for ways of alternative histories and alternative futures and things like that. So this summer in Newcastle during a residency, I was working on a research project which investigated the potential of prehistory, I suppose, as a space, a temporal space and site outside of history sort of territorialisation. So it's purely speculative space because it was before writing. So I worked in collaboration with a local identifying as women's community group called She, over a series of very experimental workshops at prehistoric rock art sites in Northumberland. And we sort of, during the workshops, they were really experimental, and I worked with them to develop sort of exercises in like improvisation, movement, myth making, storytelling, and sort of asked like what knowledge these sites might transfer, kind of addressed with more sort of playful and intuitive and kind of very like zoomorphic actions and collective actions as well. So yeah, because I want this to be like a wider conversation as well. So there's a little bit of context about the show downstairs and where it kind of came from and the research involved. So I wanted this conversation to be kind of asking everybody and the speakers to kind of talk about how ideas of like feminism, methods of feminism, collectivity, collaboration, and themes of like fantasy and fabulation and science fiction, and how these things kind of come through their practices. So I was thinking about sort of, for my practice, so I could start by just a little bit about that, and then we can kind of go to you guys. So this was very much about, for me, like listening to a sort of other sort of knowledges and epistemologies. So whether that be like through like an embodied knowledge or oral knowledges, environmental, spiritual, emotional, things like that, and collaboration, sort of horizontally shared and distributed knowledge, and sort of relinquishing leadership quite a lot with this project too. It was kind of, I think that's what's really valuable about residencies, because it's this residency in particular is very open-ended, it's very research-based, and you could sort of have a seed of an idea, but it was very flexible to kind of let others influence that project and guide where it was going to go, and also like letting giving up control and identity as like an artist with an idea, and letting a lot of the women kind of inform the way it went as well. It's really important. So yeah, we did a lot of like improvisation, like group improvisation, and there's a really interesting way of sort of hearing and sounding at the same time, and how your sense of time when that action's happening kind of collapses and becomes very much like a constellation, and delinearizes time and action actually. And thinking about sort of unknown and unmastered sort of irrational trajectories in the work. So there's a lot of astrology present in the work, tarot as well, with sort of guiding it, so it wasn't kind of relying on I guess traditional kind of ideas of very conceptual goals or pathways, and it was very much kind of going with the irrational, the hysterical, following kind of methods of dreams, of emotions, of intuition, things like that. And I think there's a lot of sort of vulnerability and sort of honesty within that as well, and yeah, and I think that's quite interesting to sort of guide you in a different way. You have to be quite kind of honest with yourself and go into these different trajectories where you didn't know where you'd end up, and then keeping the work accessible at all times, I think, was important and inclusive, because there were so many people involved. Wanting everyone to kind of understand it and enter it and then become immersed in it was quite important. So yeah, these are some of the themes I've been thinking about around like feminist methodologies. So I don't know whether you guys have sort of anything particular to kind of elaborate on those things within how you kind of work with those as well.
I was wondering if maybe either Victoria or you could talk about just not to flex, but the carrier bag. Actually,
oh yeah,
bag.
Yeah, for sure.
Just because I'm familiar with it, but maybe not everyone else. I mean, I'm loosely familiar with it.
Yeah.
But maybe it'd be good to get that, because I think if you want to do it.
Yeah, Victoria, you should definitely.
I can do that. So the carrier bag theory of fiction is one of Ursula Le Guin's non-fiction essays, where she kind of talks about the novel and science fiction novels in particular as a different mode of storytelling. She kind of posits two tools, which, like the tool is supposed to be the thing that kind of separates humanity from, the ape or whatever it was before that. So a lot of people talk about the first tool of humanity as being kind of a weapon, like a stick or a knife or something that could kill or could bash, and this represents the story of the hunt. Whereas she says actually the first tool of humanity was probably a carrier bag, because before you needed to hunt, but most people's diets would have consisted mostly of kind of like plants and oats and things that you just kind of collect, and if you don't want to spend your entire day in fields just like picking up oats and putting them in your mouth, you have a bag so you could go and do other things. So the story of the weapon, or the stick, or the kind of exciting story of the hero, is basically the story that she says it has kind of taken over history. And it's like a violent story, and it's a story of domination. But it's also like very exciting, which is why people kind of latch onto it, and why it's become so popular. And you can see kind of like around us in history and also in popular culture, the story of the hero is something that's like really, it's huge, and it's superhero stories, for example, are like what are making the most money in films right now. But then again, if you just look at history, like what's the story that we know, or like one of the biggest stories of history is the story of like Christopher Columbus, the hero who goes and discovers and conquers, like America. And we know that story is actually very different from what we're taught in schools. So there's these kind of dominant narratives that take over, which are often the story of the hero, which are simple stories, and they're didactic stories as well, which kind of tell you what to think, and there's one way to kind of consume them, and there's a moral. Whereas the kind of novel or the science fiction, or at least like good works of like social science fiction maybe, are ways of telling stories that don't kind of tell you what to think but hold everything together for kind of consideration. And there's not one way to look at them. And there are also stories that are told where the hero doesn't kind of look so, there's kind of no place for the hero.
Yeah,
I think that's a more collective way of
yeah.
figuring stories.
Yeah. I think that kind of goes back to this, this very sort of not like multi-collective narratives where there's no sort of definite hero or narrative or savior or anything. It's more complex, and there's failures, and Le Guin's sort of science fiction is very much about these they're quite observational in some ways, and nothing really happens in a lot of senses, and it's quite exploratory, and the narratives can go any which way, and there's no sort of definite linear progression. So yeah.
I think that's interesting in terms of like the sites that you've been looking at as well. So the sites in Northumberland and the sort of sites I'm interested in as well. So like Neolithic sort of rock art sites and standing stones and stone circles and things like that. It's like I can't remember that word where you said something about them as a speculative space, and the idea that these spaces have so many kind of overlaid possible narratives over them that don't fulfil the patriarchal kind of expectations of the dominant narrative of that kind of history, and how that changes over time, obviously, and their sort of contemporary use, and then new research that comes out about these kind of the actual original uses of these sites as not being what we expected, because they're pretty patriarchal. So we have to really work with
Because you sort of looked into a little bit about like altered states and looking at kind of the symbols. Because I don't know if anyone's familiar with the sites that I was working in, but a lot of the symbols are all kind of circular and spiral, and kind of forking kind of channels, going into circles and cups, and lots of kind of these chiseled sort of rings which hold water, and then channels out of water into another cup that's holding water, and things like that. And
Centuries.
and circles are kind of. Yeah, but it's sort of repeated all the way through, and across the world as well. It's not just in the UK, but
they're kind of cross-cultural, archetypal forms. That I think what you're referring to is the thing that I mentioned before in the Futures Collective project, which is because a lot of my research is around altered states and how those kind of relate to. Mystical diagrams as kind of technologies for accessing these kind of spaces. So I'm interested in these kind of rock art forms, particularly the ones which are like concentric circles or like the labyrinth kind of forms, or and the cups and rings, I guess, because there's been research more recently around these diagrams as being, so these sort of forms as being, they're thought to be produced as entoptic images, which are forms that are sort of produced through hallucinations, through visions, through visions like inside your eye. So they're not something that you see in the landscape, they're something that's like pre-programmed in your brain. And the different forms kind of directly relate to different types of altered states, so different sort of patterns of like brain frequency, so like the theta stage or the alpha stage, or and so whatever stage that you're in, the vision that you see is a different shape essentially. So that's the sort of more recent research that's come out about these forms. So that's my interest in them.
It's making me think a lot of Helena Clint.
Yeah.
Or is that not?
Which one?
Oh no, that's Suzanne
Suzanne
Tristan.
Tristan,
Yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, on the back. Yeah, actually, the book is right there.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, she saw
Yeah.
visions.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think a lot of her paintings were from visions that way.
Yeah, like very psychedelic, but also kind of, you describe these kind of circular kind of things which lead to other things, and makes me think about how her paintings kind of they are very psychedelic, but apparently she didn't take psychedelics, but they kind of like predate a lot of like surrealism and modernism even.
And she was guided by visions, right? She
Yeah.
was making her paintings. So there's a symbol, there's a thread there for sure.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting to me, and kind of at the heart of the discussions about alter states and other ways of researching, other ways of accessing knowledge, is a kind of moving away of taxonomies and categories for what is valid and invalid, and I think that goes, like, my interest in that goes to both ways of making art, but like more broadly in terms of historically and currently what is considered like a legitimate position, like quite literally, and whether and that your knowledge and research is supposed to be verifiable, but actually verifiable against a very specific system of measurement. I think in your work, Verity, with the choir community, the sheep choir, the community choir on these sites, I found it really interesting, the kind of layering of this unknown site where you can project any other kind of different kind of narrative on, because it's unknown, but there's speculation, obviously, with Maria Gimbutas's work, but also, and my interest is in these things as a curator is both form and content. So there's something about the form of working with a group of women and allowing intuition and play and improvisation to be valid ways of investigating and feeling and knowing and communing around ideas, because it enables the process of art making and myth making to actually also be about community formation and knowledge production, which I find really exciting.
Could you say something about this community working with, or something about predating the written word, or being kind of like prehistoric? It makes me think about there's another piece that Ursula Gwynn wrote, which was about kind of the written word versus the spoken word, and kind of like oral storytelling, and how oral storytelling is kind of like traditionally seen as a woman's practice, and how kind of like the oral story is much more malleable, like it changes a little bit every time you tell it and every time it's passed on.
There's no sort of strict authorship with it.
And how the written word kind of, there's like a violence to it, because obviously you write it and then it has this kind of this thing which is immovable, basically. But it also makes me think of this article that Hannah Black wrote about the figure of the gossip.
Oh yeah, I read that.
Which was basically, she talked about the figure of the gossip as like before the gossip was kind of like demonized. The gossip was somebody usually a woman in a community who would kind of like talk to all of the women and spread information among the women. And this was like a source of power. And the demonization of the figure of the gossip was kind of a way to separate women and stop them from having so much power, much in the same way as the kind of nuclear family works.
Yeah, I think I'm really, really interested in that idea of oral storytelling, actually. And one, because I think that there's a lot of, like, there's through fables and parables, Donna Haraway writes about this in relation to what's it called, Cat's Cradle, in Indigenous American communities, and these because it's always performative. If you're telling a story or showing a story, there's a performance there, and it involves, you have to be face to face with people. So there's this idea that you can, you're kind of creating something in that moment in relationship to other people, but also that in these parables and fables, like wisdom that is flattened can be held on to and can be transmitted. And a lot of my research stems from Silvia Federici's work around the Caliban and the witch, and the idea that in Europe the witch hunts were essentially a genocide against women, and they coincided with the establishment of capitalism and the kind of Enclosures Acts, and trying to suppress a lot of commonly held wisdom and knowledge about how to live and about our relationship to the land and each other. And that actually, because that was orally held, it wasn't written down, you actually had to kill the people that held it in order to get rid of it. And of course the same techniques were carried out by colonisers. And there's this kind of suppression of knowledge by sort of killing the people. So I'm quite interested in relationship to what can possibly be salvaged by actually looking at non-written practices of knowledge transmission, and finding where people have hidden their knowledge as it was getting threatened. And there's quite a few examples in, gossip, old wives' tales, like a lot of these things you could re-look at, I think, from the position of demonised knowledge.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the figure of the storyteller, but also in the act of storytelling as kind of, as you mentioned, you're kind of creating a moment where everybody's attention is focused on this kind of act, and you're kind of asking people to go on this journey with you, which is kind of, it's transformative and it's also transportative. It's like, it's fantasy essentially, but. My work is very focused on fantasy and the importance of fantasy and these kind of being able to, remove yourself from the social context that you're in into another, whether it's science fiction or fantasy, to have a better idea of what you're actually, to have a better perspective of the social context that you're actually in. But this kind of performative act which creates this moment of collectivity is very important.
Because I think if kind of moving on to looking at sort of different methods, I guess, employed to work through these ideas and things, and looking at speculation and stuff, especially, I guess, within my practice, I'm kind of looking at that historically, and actually quite within the sort of practice of archaeology, but thinking about like feminist archaeology as well. And giving sort of, expanding research into new sort of territories, and speculation, I suppose, because of this purely kind of imaginative form that it has. In a way, it has no form because it's always kind of mutating, and that actually goes very much against the sort of practice of archaeology being a scientific one. I think that there's a constant kind of tension between the science and the sort of storytelling in archaeology, which I find really interesting, because it's rooted in material cultures and excavation and materialism, I suppose. But then it's just so kind of wrapped up within storytelling and speculation, and that I find those two things sit kind of quite interesting alongside each other. I think with feminist archaeology, it's quite a relatively new sort of thing, I think, within archaeology, and it's sort of trying to sort of decenter Westernised forms of history and privileging sort of alternative conceptions and interpretations of the past. And I'm quite interested in sort of this sort of idea of, I guess, which science fiction does a lot as well, and fantasy. There's always these kind of relics or ruins from something before, and sort of the sort of fascination within those kind of sort of collapsing of civilizations, and think sort of seeds of things kind of reforming and unforming, and that being quite a cyclical narrative device, I think, within science fiction. But yeah, so that's like one of my thoughts for that.
Is that what just because when I was thinking about this about the session today, I was wondering, I saw somewhere in something you've written previously about an archaeology.
Oh yeah.
So I was wondering if is that what you describe as an archaeology?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just.
What's the difference between feminist archaeology and archaeology?
Yeah, I think I sort of took that term from an essay, looking at kind of the disciplines of like experimental archaeology and feminist archaeology and kind of renegade archaeology practices. Because I think, especially within like heritage systems as well, what I was quite interested in was this kind of very guarded kind of boundary surrounding our like heritage or kind of historical sites and things, and all the sort of language that surrounds it and the signage and everything like that, and try and access it in a different way or give access to it in some way, which wasn't through this very kind of guarded, presupposed sort of thing. So yeah, through kind of looking at this kind of more like like anarchy and just sort of gaining access to these sites when you're probably not allowed to, and yeah, there's all this because I've had a few meetings with the archaeology department in Newcastle University and talked about the ethics of the sites and how to access them, and it's very, very like, you're not allowed to touch them. There's this real kind of distancing between this tactile relationship with them and actually kind of handling them and being around the architecture of them.
Was that even in the sites in Northumberland?
Yeah,
because I went to a couple, and they were completely unlooked after.
Yeah,
totally.
And that's quite. It's really interesting actually, because when I was talking to the women about them, because they carry this kind of mythological thing where actually they're quite hidden and you can't find them very easily. And that's sort of on purpose. A lot of the women who are part of the thing are like, we know about them, but we don't like to sort of say where they are to a lot of people, because I think otherwise they'll become protected, and we don't want them to become sort of protected in a way. Yeah, exactly. So in a way they're sort of, you have to take a guide to find them, which I sort of did. You have to kind of go with the local person who's been there before, who's obviously, and that's a really nice way of sort of transferring the knowledge as well. So you're always kind of with a guide and finding out through them where these places are. But I think that's very rare. But even the professor who's sort of been studying these sites, he's like, you mustn't walk on them, you mustn't, like really like. And I just found that really annoying. And just wanted to sort of. So the first thing we kind of did was kind of take our shoes off and put your socks off and walk on them, and because they are stages a lot of the time. They're really seen that one that we were on. It's really big and they're really flat, and they're also horizontal. They're not monoliths, which is another interesting thing actually, because they go against the kind of monolithic cultures, which is quite kind of phallocentric, sort of these huge monoliths, and they're all very horizontal. And very kind of organ-like and smooth and part of the landscape, and they kind of just kind of like bones in the landscape and kind of roll out. So very much invites you to kind of go upon them, and it stages you. And that was a thing you kind of only activated in a kind of group where you went to the site and you sort of activated it. And if you're not allowed to do that, it's totally different. Yeah, so that was quite, and it was very much sort of. Because when I was sort of thinking about what ways we can kind of interpret this, without kind of leaving anything there as well, it was very much because I was thinking about potentially I could do some casts from it, take some rubbings from it, things like that. But what became apparent was that these things need to be quite fleeting, and I didn't really want anything to sort of stay put in that space. It had to be this very sort of temporal encounter, which sort of went through these different sort of methods and then evaporated.
Yeah, I guess that kind of the fleeting experience of these kind of interactions with those kind of sites is really it's really important, because they're they're sort of they're sacred spaces, like in a kind of historical sense. And taking anything away or leaving anything is doesn't feel good. I mean, you get a lot of that, obviously.
Yeah.
Particularly in places in Somerset and Wiltshire, but yeah, I think it's quite.
I think they're very they really invite performative sort of actions. And like I said, before you go there, you kind of you don't really expect that, and it's like this is very much like stays very performative, and then you walk off it. I guess the actual carvings were carried on over thousands of years, so they were they never really can date them strictly. They found sort of evidence for the tools that sort of made them beginning sort of in the Paleolithic and carried on for thousands of years until just before. It's quite abrupt, actually, weirdly, when I was speaking to the archaeologist. It's quite an abrupt sort of stop during the invention of writing as a technology. So that I found that really interesting, seeing there's so much speculation about why. But these sites, because what drew me to them were this kind of sacred site for gathering, because like Stonehenge and everything is meant to hold festivals, so it's this like kind of architecture for holding festivals and gatherings between different tribes, and then they have these kind of ceremonial causeways and like routeways kind of leading to them that links up the whole of the UK, and it was a much more sort of open and migratory landscape during those times. But these sort of spirals and circles kind of only really existing up north across this particular ridge. And I think it was just interesting to see how different they were actually to the kind of very the kind of phallic architecture of the southern sort of Neolithic sites. But
there's some rock carvings in maybe West Yorkshire. I can't remember. I've been there. It's north of. It's about an hour north of Manchester, where there's. They're obviously not the same, but they're similar kind of cup mark things. But they're on these huge kind of rocks like the ones in Northumberland. But they've also got kind of inscribed over them kind of Victorian sort of serif writing. Like someone's obviously spent a very long time carving their name in, but it's really deep. So it's obviously been something that a process that someone started, and then other people have picked up on it and continued carving the same thing, because there's no way that one person could have done it.
Yeah.
But I quite like that as a sort of people kind of over inscribing someone else's kind of mark on these ancient sites.
That's something that I didn't actually know, that the marks have been made over thousands of years, and that's interesting because it suggests a different relationship to history, massively different relationship to history, and a conversation over time, rather than this kind of preciousness we have and distance between the archaeologists you were talking to, who's don't commune with this, it's from the past, and the past is irrelevant, which is actually something I was thinking about with your work, that the kind of the use of speculation enables a really fluid relationship to time, and it sort of it allows you to sort of suspend the idea that we're all brought up with, that this is like prehistory, it's illiterate and irrelevant, but instead sort of to start a dialogue with that feels like you're kind of accessing time at different points and basically mashing that up a bit in a productive and useful way, which I think is necessary to sort of escape a certain trajectory that's been written as history's been written by a particular voice.
And to constantly question when you were talking about the feminist archaeologists, it made me think of a lot of research that I do around feminist scientists and how they like any kind of work in like these fields that already have overarching narratives. One area that I focus on is evolutionary theory, and the theory of sexual selection, which is like a theory which naturalizes, which pathologizes queer behavior and naturalizes kind of like normative states of like sex and gender and race even, and how so then the work of and this is kind of like an accepted theory that you're taught in schools, and so the work of like feminist scientists in these cases is like to not only like have to go against this, but like almost it's like coming up with alternative theories seems like a fantasy, like everything is speculation.
Yeah.
That was something that came up in a conversation at home the other day when I was referring to the plants that I just planted just before the snow came as animals that I was really worried about, and then we were talking about the fact that we don't consider plants as animals is also complete fiction. Like there's these categories that we think along. They're so accepted that actually, like even the line of distinction between like what plant is and an animal is arbitrary.
They're just kind of random categories. But even like I was reading the introduction to Timothy Morton's new book, and one of his big things is like the whole idea of nature is a construct. You know, we all live in the biosphere and nothing is not from this earth. So we need to stop making this distinction, because that's when we create distance from nature, and that's when we cause a lot of violence towards nature, and then in fact,
because it's other, isn't it?
But interestingly, one of the speculatively, one of the definitions of sentience is the ability to produce fiction. So it's like the ability to envisage your own death or plan ahead, or that kind of thing. So I'd say that I think that has a really nice connection with the relationship with time, and that like. Maybe it's not about whether you can feel pain or not. It's more about whether you can actually imagine like the end of yourself, or like.
When does that do?
I can't remember. Sorry. I think it might be from Stephen Shavero. I think. I'll try and remember. It might be.
Go home and Google sentience as the ability to produce fiction.
I think it's from Discognition, from Stephen Shavero. But I also like it's envisaging your own death, but also just planning ahead, which is really like quite a banal,
making shopping lists.
But equally, some plants can do that as well, can plan ahead. So
arguably bacteria can.
Well, I think that's the discognition, where it comes in with discognition, is that it's talking about slime mould.
Okay.
And discussing whether slime mould is sentient, or that it has these. It's like a plant, technically a plant that exhibits human characteristics in some sense.
How so?
By the way it communicates across. Like multi-celled organism, what is it? Like, it's like a group, it's like a plant that communicates with its external kind of edges. I can't explain it.
It's pretty blobby.
I think that's why it came in.
But then there's loads, maybe this is a bit off topic, but no it's not, but there's loads of stuff coming out now that they've got really super clever cameras, and there's something on BBC recently where they've managed to film ants like really closely and really understand their behaviour much more, and they really do plan ahead. Like loads of them knew that something was happening that was going to potentially threaten their anthill, and so they all arranged to stand outside and simultaneously squirt their poison, so that there was a kind of mass squirting of poison and it would stop. Wow. I think it was baboons from destroying their anthill. But that's planning ahead, arguably. And understanding that you're threatened. So anyway, but yeah, taxonomies.
I think what's quite interesting about that sense of like planning, kind of like ideas of the future, coming back to
Sorry.
No, but it is like these other concepts of time and I guess obviously capitalism, so progress driven and future orientated and collapsed, I suppose, and accelerated and for me, because I've always had this interest in sort of philosophy of time and how we think about time, and that was another real draw to thinking about it in other ways before writing, was when it was an oral thing, and there wasn't any kind of, I guess, technology to record time in that sense. There was no power over it, and it kind of, other kind of cyclical beat, like the moon, for instance, and we were talking about the Future as a Collective project and how the meetings were kind of organised by the lunar cycles, looking at kind of women's time, matriarchal time, being another sort of way to think about this kind of flux that didn't necessarily have to be a sort of a fixed thing. Like bodily time, dream time, and even thinking about death and how looking at kind of, I guess, a lot of these prehistoric sites are tied to sort of burial rites, and there'd be cairns sort of around the areas, and where multiple generations of people would be buried and then resurrected, because there's kind of evidence where the bones, the flesh would be stripped off the bones would be decorated with red ochre and brought back out and performed in. And put back in again. All the bones of different generations were modelled up together, and different ideas of death, different ideas of time, and sort of birth and death being very liminal spaces. So there wasn't kind of beginning and end. There's more kind of moving through, a dimension, I suppose. And then, I think for me that really kind of. I was really interested in that and looking at kind of time in a different sense.
That's something I've thought a lot about, actually. And there's the idea of progress in that sense, and I think it's so crucial that we understand that progress is only progress for some people at some point in time, and that this idea that we're sold, that we're moving forward and progressing and things are getting better is really not true. It's based on one perspective by very few people, and it's tied to the linearity of time, and that things must necessarily progress. So I think, for me, programming the Future as a Collective project, where the lunar cycle was a very tiny little nod to trying to step out of that conception and stand from a different perspective almost. Because to progress certain things, you have to destroy others. So,
and I think just ideas of cyclical time and space is really important, and I think themes of deep time as well, and looking at kind of geological time, especially thinking about this kind of, I guess, moment we are at the moment with environmental kind of time and kind of posthumanism, and obviously that kind of you sort of look to the deep past, and there's all these sort of ideas of global warming is it's just a natural sort of thing that occurs, and it will just humanity kind of isn't really a part in it, because obviously environmental time doesn't have any concern for humanity, so it's just another cycle, and whether we're on the other side of it is don't know. Interesting to think about.
Was that, have you read Stories of Your Life by Chen Chen? It's like a book of short stories. It's really good, but the kind of random, but it was made into a Hollywood film with I can't remember the actress with the red hair, called Arrival.
Oh yeah.
Film?
Yeah.
So it was it was a short story and a really good book of sci-fi short stories. But yeah, kind of this one anomaly where Hollywood made this like science fiction story, not about like a hero, but about these aliens which come and like inexplicably teach humans this language which shows them that everything is happening at once and time is not linear.
Was that the one when they came down in the pods?
Yeah.
And it was in this big circle, wasn't it? This language is like,
Yeah. But that kind of typical thing. Yeah, it was a better story than a movie. They obviously added in some things like a lot of romance and also had to China as the enemy.
That's Stories of Your Life.
Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang.
Yeah, I think that kind of idea of time as all happening at once, sort of simultaneous time. It's kind of what I was looking at actually in the philosophy, like Greek philosophy of time as well, with Kairos and Chronos, and looking at chaos theory and I guess that's a whole different tangent actually from this, but I think it's really, really interesting.
But it's like, I think I could never really conceive of that kind of perception of time before I read that short story. He's a good example of an author who like does his research in science and then writes science fiction about it to kind of make you better understand it.
Yeah, I think this is like, because I guess now like science has got to the point where it has become so, like all those sort of ideas of fiction has become so entangled with that, hasn't it? Like, the multiverse and string theory and all this stuff. It's just like, it's become that.
But I mean that's like, I feel like all science is storytelling in a way. It's like looking at a set of data points and then making a story from it. And there's many different stories that you can tell from one set of data.
Have you guys got any questions, by the way? Anything you want to add?
Quick question. Just thinking about the sort of such big narratives and like environmentalism and like how humanity like links in with that. I guess things that draw me to Verity is like the idea of collectivism and like how to use the collective as like a sort of catalyst for change. But maybe it's a question for all of you, like how do you use collectivity or like keep some sort of hope or positivity within these deeper questions that sometimes when you look at it, like when you zoom out, it just looks so challenging.
I think hope's a really interesting thing actually. I've been thinking a lot about hope. And because I went to the feminist duration reading group and the conversations get really, really like bleak. And and I guess that if obviously there's sort of lots of sort of fight for and a fight against, and then it becomes this very kind of angry spiral of despair, I suppose, and trying to kind of retain a hope. And that's actually, it's quite interesting thinking about that in terms of like science fiction and thinking about it, because when I was working on this project in Northumberland, I was kind of worried about it. Like, is this kind of escapism? Am I sort of trying to escape from this? Is this sort of something that is a bad thing? And then this I kept returning to this idea of hope and actually having a kind of hopeful practice or something that could be like naive, it could be idealistic, utopian, but it is that sort of working towards like a hopeful kind of outcome. I kind of need it to sustain me and my well-being as an artist, I think. but yeah, collective hope. I think also there's the energy you get from stepping outside the art world too, and working with people going about their day-to-day stuff, and having like just like really like nice conversations about like biscuits and stuff, and like trees, and you know, and all these stories as well from the landscapes. A lot of the women were very local, and all the kind of the folklore and things, and it does sort of take you out of this very like despairing sort of space, but it is a very hopeful space, and you know, it's just learning from other people and transferring energy in that way, because you can kind of maintain or sustain yourself from collective energy and enthusiasm. And I think in the art world as well, it can become very competitive, individualistic, and and you can feel very like responsible and solo, and it's having this sort of for me it was very much a coping mechanism to really like collaborate, because it makes everything so much like nicer, and I mean I wouldn't really know how to do stuff on my own actually now.
That for me, that's the role of science fiction and fantasy. That's like one of the things. One of Ursula Le Guin's like most famous speeches when she's accepting some big book award, or I think letter writing award or something. She says like, we will need writers who can imagine some real grounds for hope, and that's like. It also makes me think of there's two women in the U.S. who put together an anthology of short stories called Octavia's Brood, where they just asked activists to write science fiction, because their whole thing is like, in order to be able to work towards a better future, you have to imagine it. And who better to imagine like what a better world would like look like and function and feel like than activists. So that, I mean, that for me is like the whole thing of fantasy and science fiction, is to kind of like create this other space that you then can move towards. Otherwise, you're just kind of looking around in despair.
Yeah, I'm very much with you on that. For me, fiction has the ability to create something that does not yet exist to aim towards. I'm also really interested in the fact that, and maybe it hooks into the activists writing in the Octavia's Brood thing, but that fiction and fantasy is usually coupled with being in a position of lack and having desire for something. So I guess something I'm really interested in is you know, the desires that people have for things to be different, and actually like giving those some space and power, again, around those fictions, and it comes back to the storytelling thing, I think, but like actually, for me, I see creating spaces to think and reflect and work together, even if it's just a case of like sharing stories and gathering around those stories, is hopeful. And it's something that's always at the back of my mind, is I went to China, to Beijing in 2013, and was just trying to see what's going on in the art world there, basically. I met this group of artists. Well, there's a couple of artists that went under the name of 6A, and they were like a group of artists and activists and academics, and it was ever growing, amorphous group of people. And they were gathering under the name 6A because of the 6 principles of Confucius, and they were going out every month to one of the few Buddhist monasteries that hadn't yet been destroyed in the Cultural Revolution, basically. And they were going, and they each had to identify their own 6 principles, but together they were sort of strengthening themselves and sharing, gathering tools to like commit to a revolution. And some of those things were like getting really strong, and they had to literally like be prepared to fight. And I guess that's always at the back of my mind, in the sense of like continually trying to create spaces and share tools to be ready for whatever. And I don't know what those tools are, but like that is a thing. heard that.
Like Daughters of the North by Sarah Hall.
No, Dodgers of the North.
Daughters.
Daughters, no.
It's about a commune in the Lake District that are a feminist female commune that are getting ready for revolution. So they're all getting really strong.
Yeah.
Recommended.
But yeah, I like that. Maybe we need to start weightlifting. Practicing archery.
I mean, I think for me, sort of collective working is very much kind of like what you described, which is this kind of transfer of energy and like validation of practices and kind of trajectories in research and stories. It's all of these things. I think for me, it's like it's a very kind of important sort of means to a collective end, I think.
But it's also, and I kind of, what you were saying about having nice conversations, but I actually think that the forging of friendships and relationships is obviously really important because you're forming a community and a network.
Yeah.
I think that can't be discounted.
Yeah, definitely.
Verity, could you just say a little bit more about the methods that how you work with the women? How did you work with the women's group? How did you direct them or not direct them? How did you, what kind of, and also the female dancer, the movement artists, how you, I'm just interested, curious.
Well, I kind of entered it without a plan, which was really hard. So to begin with, I knew I wanted to work with a sort of a local community group to where I was staying in Newcastle, and I wanted to be part of the group, so I didn't want to be this kind of outsider or visitor. And I think the kind of most open form of that was this kind of community choir where, it was very collaborative, and so I just like Googled loads of different kind of choir groups or different kind of community groups, I suppose, and this one was really close to me. And joined them for 3 weeks, just as like a visitor, and got to know them really well.
You participated fully in what they were doing as a member of the group,
Yeah.
I think pretty important.
Yeah, I didn't really, I said I was an artist, but I didn't say really what I was doing. I said I was sort of like staying in the local area and just wanted to kind of get to know people, so it was very much a social thing. And it because I was massively out of my comfort zone, because I'm terrified of singing, and so it was very much like wanting to learn and empower my own voice, because it's very much about kind of empowering women's voices, and the way it's taught as well is there's no real conductor. Anyone can kind of volunteer if they want to sing a song that they like, and it's just call and response, so you just copy them. Which is really great and really fun and really sort of informal. That sort of happened, got to know them really well, and then sort of introduced a kind of potential project. Well, my interest basically, I said I'm really interested in these sites, these archaeological sites that are quite unique to this area. Does anyone know anything about them? And then it was some of the women really did, and some didn't, and were very interested in them. There was actually already a kind of radical matriarchal studies group in the 90s that used to do these kind of field trips out there, apparently, that one of the women used to do in the 90s. And she could kind of remember some of the stuff they were talking about, so it was sort of learning from that as well. And basically a process of just like lots of talking and lots of communication. And then one of the girls who sort of started it up, she was a music therapist and looks a lot about like voice and healing and collective healing, and she sort of, I was just talking to her about what techniques she uses, really interested in that idea, and they sort of demonstrated some stuff and was like, and obviously that I was a part of as well, and then I said, well, it'd be really cool if we could go, organise a kind of field trip to these sites, and like I because we sort of talked about these things that we could do, but it was very much like not wanting to have a plan or direct it, and I wanted to be doing the stuff as well, and so we just arrived at the sites and then taking lots of like tea and coffee and stuff, and spent with a view to kind of spend a day there, and then just kind of see, respond, walk around, feel, see how kind of the space affects the group, and it was literally just turning up and kind of making it up as we went along, really. Kind of purposefully, actually, that I found really difficult, so I'm really organised. So I found it really hard to like not organise anything. Yeah, and I think it's really important because I just didn't want to confine it to any order, and it was just like it could have just been chaos, and people could have hated it. And that was my main like worry, that they would just, because also you're responsible for it, so it was like, you know, I'm taking all these women out here, and like if they don't, if it's boring or like not interesting, you know. So, but luckily everyone's really into it, and then and then some of the women were like, oh, you know, just responding to the architecture, so yeah, this big channel carved through, and we're like, the first thing you'll do is put your face in it. So we all just put our faces in it, and then just started like throwing noises through it, and that's from one of the recordings in the corridor downstairs. And it's the first time that any of us had improvised before, so it's actually quite like amazing if you've never done. I mean, lots of the artists and things are kind of used to that practice, but to a lot of the women, it was like actually an incredibly emotional thing to do, and that was what was really interesting to kind of make noise and hear, because we were all really like cheek to cheek, and I didn't really know these women very well, so it was very like intimate kind of exposing activity that was really facilitated by this like stone, and yeah, it was really powerful, and a lot of the women just got like really emotional afterwards. And one of the women in her sort of late 70s was saying how she would just never imagine in a million years that she'd be doing this. You know, like it's just she's like, how have I ended up doing this now? How am I going to explain this to my grandson? You know, it's just been like so wild. And she's like, I can't believe I've been able to do this. It's really amazing. Yeah, and it's just like just in a constant sort of state of experimentation. And then it was very much like you were saying, like giving the permission for these things. It's like we were all trying to really be like, if you know, this feels really stupid or uncomfortable, you know, it's fine to laugh at yourself, and it's fine to like laugh at anyone else as well. And you know, because I felt really like embarrassed a lot of the time, and a lot of the women did. It wasn't like this really kind of like sacred thing. Actually, it was a really, really stupid. A lot of it was really stupid. And yeah, and you because you wanted to get on the stone. A lot of it was like. Yeah, we sort of spent some time until it got boring, essentially. So there wasn't even any time sort of codes. It wasn't like we're going to do this half an hour, we're going to do that. It was very much like, oh, okay, done that now. Yeah, very childish in that way, and playful, and luckily I didn't. I mean, yeah, I didn't have to direct it really. It was just. It was a very sort of process-based research, because I didn't know what was going to happen. It was just, for me, it was kind of to go and inform the project and see what happened, and then we sort of kept checking in with each other and feeding back, and like, what does that feel like? What does that do? Why are we doing it? What, you know, trying to sort of get some sort of reflexive feedback going as well, and with the stories as well that we were writing. And thinking about, actually, what I find really interesting is all the stories, the myth making we were doing was all, the women were putting themselves as the mark makers in the present. So it wasn't this kind of historical, like there was a person in the distant past. It was very embodied, actually, that idea of time, which was really interesting for me. But with Alice, so Alice was part of the group, and I was living with her actually in the house that I was staying in, which was kind of coincidental, or fatalistic. And yeah, so she was actually working with refugee women and looking at like bodies and working with movement and doing different sort of experimental things in choreography. And so we kind of really, at the same time, so we really wanted to work together, really similar interests. And she again works a lot with like healing and movement and breathing and things like that. So she also like volunteered to do a few things and lead a couple of things as well. And then I returned with her to sort of do some recording, because none of this was going to go into a film, but often I would just record kind of a lot of processes just to keep it, and then I might use tiny fragments of certain things in different films, so I kind of used kind of a collage process of lots of layering of different fragments. But with Alice it ended up being this, we went to this one site on a very, very windy day, and just spent a lot of time on another one of these stones, where she sort of went into quite a kind of hypnotic state and just carried on for hours and hours and hours. And and it was just, and I was just kind of getting quite immersed in it, and letting her have that space and kind of hold that space, and because she was involved with the workshops as well, because I'm quite interested in how these events kind of transfer through like memory, or because the actual song on the soundtrack for the film is one of the women from the workshops doing a kind of recollection from that event in the city. So she's just at home doing this kind of trying to get her to sort of like reimagine or memorise the kind of emotional modes that she went through and sort of express that. And then in April I'm hopefully going back and doing a kind of a sort of exercise in reenactment, and how you kind of recreate past events, and how you transfer that to people that weren't there. So having some of the women who couldn't make the workshops involved with this workshop, where some of the women who we're going to kind of do this again sort of with clay or something, kind of reforming the spaces, and having this sort of mixture between people who weren't there but imagining it through the actions of the women who were, and then together creating something kind of in between. What was and what wasn't. So that's another kind of experiment, which I don't know what's going to happen with that. But yeah, I think it's really, because that's quite a new direction for me. I think the last couple of years, and this in sort of having a very like collective practice, you have to just completely give up any idea of like or control of what you're going to come out with, really. Which can be very like stressful, but in a good way. Obviously, it's like,
I think there's what you were describing of working with the group at the Stones, and also you did a second group, a visit in the rain. I quite like I just think it's nice, for me anyway, there's a lot to be said for kind of bonding through ordeal, and in the nicest possible way. I think by ordeal I mean just like high intense emotions, and that can be bad as well as good, as a way of bringing people together. And I've been invited to be part of a collaborative group, and we've been talking about how to produce a collectivity, which goes back to Nina's question. And then part of our discussion is like how to induce an ordeal in order to bond through something. But I think it's that is like a method of kind of forming a really close, intimate relationship with people you may not know at all previously. It's really important.
Because it happens really. You kind of skip a few kind of like social kind of boundaries, don't you, when that happens? And that really happened with the choir thing as well, because I was in sort of this level of stress, like a lot, just feeling super vulnerable. Just singing, it was just part of the choir, and just be like, oh. But you just really rely on straight away like these people to really like hold you in this, and you kind of just really like skip that whole like social. All those sort of layers in that, and become very close very, very quickly. And that was something that, especially when you're doing a residency, when you're kind of there, I was there for 2 months, but I've always found it really hard, because especially if you want to work collectively and you're not from that place, and you're like the ethics of kind of entering a new place as an outsider, and how to approach that, I found really, really hard. And it was just, again, it was trying different ways, and I didn't know how to really, but it was really trying to like, you had to get to know people very quickly, very intimately, because it was a very kind of intimate, like shared experience, that you can't just kind of like create straight away. But no, that's really interesting.
But also I hadn't really thought about it until you were talking just now, because I've heard you describe the project before, but it's almost like it's not just the fact that it's improvisation, which is one thing in itself, but actually it's also that it's like non-verbal. It's not text based. It's the noises, they're like animal noises, and that has a whole other sort of strangeness to it, which I think it kind of compounds that sort of anxiety of the performance.
Yeah.
And we talked actually, because I joined in one of the workshops and was equally uncomfortable. But it was it's something about we were wondering, we were talking about it afterwards, whether some of that is actually being a woman and not you're not supposed to make certain noises, or like being silence, being loud.
It's like I find it really hard to be loud.
Being loud and like very much unattractive in typically considered sense of the word, and just like wailing and bellowing and whatever else comes out of your mouth. And but whether it felt like a bit of a transgression, is what I mean.
Yeah, actually, because Alice, who's one of the dancers, she's got a really interesting, her kind of, she's very, very like feminine, but she's such a strength in kind of like her movements, like really kind of, really powerful, and she's covered in bruises, and she's really like strong, deep kind of Huddersfield accent, and like it's just really, and when she was doing the part of the improvisation, she's this really like, gravelly kind of, so she's so embarrassed about it, you know, she's like, oh god, I can't, like all these, because you can hear these lovely kind of lilting, like girly sort of sounds, and then you can sort of hear Alice's like gravelly like grumbles, and she's just like really embarrassed about it. It's just like, it's awful that this is so like, that the voice is so controlled in that way, even when you're with women, and it's just, like you said, it's that thing which is just like, oh god, I can hear my voice and it sounds like really awkward, like really not pretty, you know, it's that thing of just, which is awful.
So she doesn't, because she's a dancer, she's not using her voice either, no?
No, not at all. Yeah, so she was quite really out of her comfort zone with that. But I think because one of the things I was thinking about with the reenactment was to try and remove language from that as well. So it'd be a transference of this event through noise, movement, play, and not language, and just see how that kind of worked. Because it was very communicative. Like with when we were passing. I don't know if you were there. We were passing the sounds to each other up and down this line.
No, I was at the rainy one.
We didn't. Yeah, I didn't. We got drowned out there. But you end up kind of like, you really like embody the noises so they're quite animalistic, and then you sort of really like perform that as well, and it's and the way you sort of communicate that becomes very bodily, because you don't have language. You end up becoming very much more like, your body becomes part of that communication. So it'd be quite interesting to see how that level of communication can kind of be transferred in a group without language.
Yeah, because I found it interesting in the like minibus on the way back that, I mean, I know a lot of those women were from choir, so maybe they do this all the time, but maybe they don't. And I joined in when you joined in quite happily. And the minibus on the way back, everyone was just sort of singing rounds and like collective folk songs, and everyone was joining in, and it was just like somehow we transcended into this like total like singing community for an hour as we drove back. And
we didn't talk.
No, it was just constant singing, and it was I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
But as if it forged something. The voicing out, and actually in a really small way, I always make people do that in my reading groups, where people but encouraged to read a paragraph each out loud, because I'm convinced that if you've already voiced in a group, then you're much more likely to speak and contribute.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah, that makes
I've got no
difference.
proof of that, but I'm just convinced that's the case.
And it's just like, I remember when I first joined the group, and I just found it really difficult, and I said, no, I don't want to do it. And then it is just like, once you do it, it's that barrier, isn't it? You kind of immediately kind of gain permission to be able to use your voice and sort of contribute. Any more questions or comments? I'm not sure, what's the time? 6. Okay.
Oh wow, that's good timing.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for. Unless anyone else wants to add anything. I don't know. No? Good?
I still want to add something.
Cool. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Will we be going for a drink to finish the conversation?
Huh?
Will we be going for a drink to
If you-
continue
yeah,
the
if you want.
conversation?
Yeah. I didn't know, like, because Friday night, you know, people were going out afterwards, had their own plans, but yeah, we can go to the pub. The roads.
Thank you, Verity.
Thanks for inviting me.